Hare Krishna. Welcome to the TaxGuru YouTube channel. This is Rohan Pingai, practicing chartered accountant based in Mumbai, also partner in Motilal and Associates LLP, member firm of Marks Network. Welcome to the video series on Income Tax Act 2025, and today is session 3. So let's dive into it. Let me allow to share my screen. Yes. So in episode 1, we understand what taxation is, why governments levy taxes, and the constitutional framework governing the taxation in India. In episode 2, that is second, we travel through the fascinating history of direct taxation in India, from the taxation principles of ancient India and the British era to the Income Tax Act 1961, and finally the introduction of the new Income Tax Act 2025. Now that we understand why tax laws exist and how they evolved, it is time to open the what statute itself. One common mistake made by the students and even professionals is attempting to memorize individual sections without understanding the overall architecture of the legislation. So imagine trying to navigate a city without first looking at it as a map, its map. You may eventually what reach your destination, but the journey will be slow and confusing. So similarly, before studying individual provisions of the Income Tax Act, we must first understand its overall structure, how the act is organized, how different chapters connect with one another, where various concepts are located, and how to quickly navigate the law. So, by the end of this episode, you will not merely know the chapters of the act, you will understand the logic behind its design and develop the ability to locate any provision with confidence. So let's begin our journey into the architecture of the Income Tax Act 2025. So today's episode is one of the most important foundation session we can say of the entire course. Many learners what jump directly into the charging provisions, deductions, exemptions, or assessments. However, professional tax practice begins with what understanding the structure of the legislation itself. So think of the Income Tax Act as a large building. Before entering individual rooms, you should know how many floors exist, which where each department is located, which corridors connect various sections, which provisions are general, which are special. So once we understand this architecture, learning becomes what significantly easier. So this episode is therefore not about memorizing the sections, it is about understanding the blueprint of the India's income tax law. So let's start. Why understanding the architecture matters. So many professionals spend years searching what for provisions simply because they never understood where provisions are logically placed. So understanding the architecture helps you what locate the provisions quickly, connect one chapter with another, understand why a particular provision exists, read amendments intelligently, and develop what confidence while handling the practical cases. For example, suppose someone asks, what is the taxability of salary? So instead of randomly searching the statute, you immediately know the logical sequence. What charging provisions, heads of income, salary chapter, computation provisions, exemptions, TDS provisions, return file. So the professional efficiency begins with what structural understanding. What is the Income Tax Act 2025? So the Income Tax Act 2025 is the principal legislation governing taxation of income in India. It provides what? Who is liable to tax? Which income is taxable? Which income is exempt? How taxable income is computed? Applicable tax rates, assessment procedures, recovery mechanisms, appeals, then penalties, prosecutions, administrative provisions. So it serves as what backbone of the India's direct tax system. Every assessment, notice, refund, appeal, penalty, or compliance requirement ultimately derives what its authority from this legislation. Moving further, let's see, is the act a complete law? Very important to understand. So many beginners assume that the everything is contained within the act itself. That is not correct. The income tax ecosystem consists of several interconnected legal instruments. The Act provides the substantive law. The rules prescribe what procedural details, forms facilitate what statutory compliance, notifications operationalize what delegated powers, and then circulars clarify what administrative provisions. So, and judicial decisions interpret the law as well and resolve what disputes. So together, this creates what the complete legal framework governing the income taxation. So understanding this hierarchy is essential because many practical questions cannot be answered by reading only the act itself. That is the reason. So it connectivity is like act, rules, forms, notifications, circulars, judicial precedents. Let's understand hierarchy of the income tax law. So every tax provision derives its validity from a legal hierarchy. At the highest level of the stands, the Constitution of India, which empowers to whom Parliament to levy what taxes on the income. Next comes the Income Tax Act enacted by the Parliament. So every year, the Finance Act amends the various provisions and prescribe the tax rates wherever applicable. The central government frames the income tax rules. Whom? The central government frames the income tax rules under the powers delegated by the Act. Then CBDT issues notifications, orders, and circulars to administer the law. That is explanation, clarification. So finally, courts and tribunals interpret what these provisions whenever dispute arise between the two parties. So whenever two authorities appear inconsistent, this hierarchy helps what determine the which provisions prevails. Next, understanding the architecture of the act. So every legislation follows a structured drafting pattern. Income Tax Act is divided into parts. Within parts come what chapters. Within chapter comes the sections. Then sections are further divided into subsections, clauses, subclauses, explanations, provisos if any, then illustrations wherever applicable. So certain matters are also dealt with through schedules. So once you understand this hierarchy, reading legislation becomes what much easier. Very important to know this. Let's understand components of the section. So every section should be read carefully. The main provision states the general rule. A proviso generally creates an exception, qualification, or additional condition also. So proviso serves three parts, that is exception, qualification, or additional condition. So an explanation clarifies what legislative intent behind the provision and removes what ambiguity. That is the role of the explanation. Sometimes multiple explanations exist. So certain sections also contains exceptions, deeming provisions, and special situations. So one common mistake is reading only the opening sentence while ignoring the provisos and explanations. That also need to be read and understand. So in tax law, the real meaning often lies within these supporting provisions. Next, broad flow of the Income Tax Act. So the act follows a logical sequence. It first introduces what law and important definitions. Then it identifies who is liable to tax. Then next it determines the scope of taxable income. After establishing the taxability, it provides what rules for computation. So once income is computed, the law deals with assessment procedures. So then come provisions relating to the collection and recovery. And if dispute arise, the act provides what? Appellate remedies. So finally, it contains provisions dealing with the penalties, prosecutions, administration, and miscellaneous matters. So this logical progression mirrors what the actual life cycle of the taxation. Let's understand life cycle of income tax under the income under the act. So every taxpayer follows a legal journey. Income is first what? Earned. Then the law determines whether it is taxable or not. Then if taxable, income is computed according to the statutory provisions. Tax liability is calculated. The taxpayer files the return. Department processes it or assesses the return. Refund or tax demand may arise. And if disagreements occur, appeals follow. So understanding this life cycle helps what one connect various chapters of the act. So instead of studying isolated provisions, we begin seeing the taxation as an integrated process. Very important. Let's see bird's eye view of the Income Tax Act 2025. At a high level, the Income Tax Act can be visualized in 7 broad segments. So first, it lays the legislative foundation by defining what important concepts and establishing the charging mechanism. Second, it determines the scope of taxable income. Then third, it provides computational machinery for arriving at the taxable income. Then fourth, it lays down compliance requirements such as return filing, tax payment, reporting obligations, disclosures. Then fifth, it empowers the tax authorities with the administrative and assessment powers. Then six, it creates mechanism for enforcement through interest, penalties, and executions. And finally, it established a dispute resolution framework also through appeals, revisions, and judicial review. So the bird's eye view serves what? The mental roadmap for every future episode in the series, which we are conducting. Let's see, understanding the legislative blueprint. So we have understood the broad flow of the act. Now let us look at the philosophy behind its design. It has been drafted like a well-designed operating what manual. So every chapter answers a specific question. For example, who is liable? What is the taxable? When does tax arise? How income is computed? How much tax is payable? How tax collected? And what if there is a dispute? So what happens if there is a non-compliance also? So each chapter builds upon the previous, means each chapter builds upon the previous one. So imagine constructing a building. You first buy what? You first lay the foundation of it. So then build the structure and then install electricity and plumbing, and finally you ensure the maintenance and security. Similarly, the Income Tax Act begins with what? The foundation and gradually moves towards the compliance and administration and dispute resolution. So understanding this sequence will make every future chapter easier to learn. Journey of taxpayer through Income Tax Act. So let us understand the law from the taxpayer's perspectives or point of view. Every taxpayer follows the same legal journey. Step one, a person earns income, then act determines whether that income is taxable or not. Then law classifies the income under the appropriate head like salary, other source, capital gain, business and profession. The taxable amount is then computed after considering the deductions, exemptions, set off and carry forward provisions. And then applicable tax rates are applied on the total income. And then advance tax, TDS, and self-assessment tax are adjusted. And after that, taxpayer files the income tax return and department then process or assess the return. So if dispute arise, the appellate provisions become applicable or trigger. So every major chapter of the act fits somewhere in the journey. So once you visualize this flow, you no longer study isolated provisions. You understand the entire what? Tax ecosystem. Let's see major functional blocks of the Income Tax Act. So instead of remembering the dozens of chapters individually, professionals usually divides the act into functional blocks. It will be easier to understand. The first block establishes the legal foundation. The second determines the taxability. Third computes the taxable income. Fourth determines the tax liability, and fifth governs the compliance. So next deals with assessment and administration, and then provides mechanism for collection and recovery. So finally, miscellaneous provisions cover administrative powers, penalties, and procedural matters. So this classification helps professionals immediately identify where a particular issue belongs. So whenever a client asks a question, your first thought should be which functional block governs this issue. So that habit dramatically improves what legal interpretation also. Let's understand foundation provisions. So every legislation begins with by laying its foundation. So the opening provisions generally defines the name of the legislation, the date from which it becomes effective, like Income Tax Act 2025 effective from 1st April 2026. So important legal definitions, scope of the applications, interpretation of key expressions. So why this is so important? Because every latter provision depends upon these definitions. Suppose the act defines the word person. So single definition may apply to hundreds of the sections throughout the legislation. So we need to interpret accordingly. Similarly, definition of terms like income, assessment year, previous year, company, resident, capital assets becomes the backbone of the entire act. So professional interpretation always begins with what definitions? Charging provisions, the heart of the act. So every taxable statute must contain a charging provisions. So without a charging provisions, tax cannot be legally collected. So the charging provisions answers three basic questions: who is liable, what is tax, and when is tax levied. So this is why charging provisions are often described as heart of the legislation. So whenever courts interpret tax laws, they first examine what charging section, because no tax can exist without express legislative authority. So remember one fundamental principle here. There can be no taxation by implication. Tax must be clearly imposed by law. Principle protects the taxpayers and ensures what constitutional validity. Now moving further, understand machinery provisions, making the law work. The charging provisions alone cannot what operate. Imagine a law that simply says income shall be taxed. But immediately several questions will arise. How do we calculate income? What deductions are available? Who assesses the tax? When should returns be filed? How will tax be recovered? So these answers are provided through the machinery provisions. So courts have repeatedly explained what that charging provisions and machinery provisions work what together. One creates the liability, the other implements it. So complete tax law, therefore, always contains what both. So distinction is one of the most important concepts every tax professional must understand. How different chapters are connected, like definition, residential status, scope of income, heads of income. So let us see how one chapter naturally flows into another. Suppose an individual receives salary from a foreign employer. Can we immediately calculate tax? No, not at all. We first determine whether the individual is resident or non-resident as per the provision, respective provision under the Income Tax Act 2025. Then we examine the scope of total income. Only then do we classify the income under the head salary. Then next we compute the taxable salary. After that, the deductions are allowed wherever applicable. So finally, total income is what calculated. Tax rates are often applied. This demonstrates that one provision cannot be studied independently. Every chapter supports the next. So the Act functions as one integrated system. Very careful. The Act functions as a one integrated system. It is not an different and isolated sections. Reading section like a professional. Very, very important. So one of the biggest mistake students or professional make is reading only the first sentence of the section. Professional reading follows a disciplined approach, step by step. Okay, step one, reading the heading, then it gives the legislation context, then read the complete section without interruption, read every proviso. The earlier step also, that is the complete read complete section without interpretation, without interruption, is also very much important. Read every proviso. Then sometimes the proviso completely changes the meaning of the original section. So read every explanations. Many practical issues are resolved here. So check whether the section refers to what another provision. Cross references are extremely common in tax litigation that need to be analyzed. Verify whether any important term is what separately defined. So never assume the ordinary dictionary meaning where the act provides statutory definition. This reading techniques saves what professionals from the countless interpretational mistakes. Let's understand cross references. So the Income Tax Act contains numerous cross references. For example, one section may state subject to the provisions of or as provided under or notwithstanding anything contained in. So these expressions are extremely important. So they indicate what the relationship between the two provisions. Since some sections overrides others, some operates only after another section. So some creates what exceptions. So therefore, never read any section in isolation. Whatever reference is given with that particular section, that need to be read. Rule also need. So professional interpretation always involves reading connected provisions together. So this habit significantly improves what legal accuracy. Developing the right approach to studying the act. So here, before we conclude this part, let us discuss the most effective way to study the income tax law. What is it? Many students begin by memorizing section numbers. Unfortunately, that approach rarely succeeds. So instead, understand the concept first. Very important. When we studied also, where it is very important to clear your concept. Then it will be easy in exam. Like that, we need to understand the concept first. So then the understand the legislative framework. So read the Bare Act repeatedly, repeat after it, whatever you are reading one time, two times. Observe how one provision connects with another. Gradually, section numbers will become what familiar naturally, and that is important. When you read, repeat on a consistent basis, it will automatically recollect or remember. So professional expertise is never built through the memorization alone, right? Very important. So it develops through repeated reading, conceptual understanding, and continuous application. So as we progress through this series, I encourage you to keep a copy of the Income Tax Act besides you. Very important to read. So every episode should be accompanied by the reading the corresponding statutory provisions wherever necessary, and the single habit will distinguish you from a average learner. So now in the next part, so we understand the philosophy of the act till that. Let us visualize its overall architecture. Think of the Income Tax Act as well as it is a organized university. Means think that way. That what the organized university like that. So each department specializes in particular subject. Similarly, the Income Tax Act is divided into the logical clusters of what chapters reading. So first cluster lays the legal foundation, then next cluster determines who is taxable on what income. Then following the chapters explain how taxable income should be computed under different dates. After computation comes what determine the tax liability, then followed by the provisions relating to filing of the returns, payment of taxes, assessments, reassessments, recovery, penalties, appeals, and administration. So rather than viewing the act as a hundreds of independent sections, professionals visualize it as a series of connected modules, each performing a distinct what function. So this approach dramatically improves your legal understanding and practical application. So the four pillars of the income tax law we can say are taxability, computation, compliance, and administration. So the first pillar is what taxability, right? So these provisions determine whether an income is taxable at all. That is the main question need to ask. So questions such as, is the person liable? Is the income taxable? Is it exempt? Need to answer. And second pillar is computation. Here, once income is taxable, the law explains how to compute. So this includes valuation rules, deductions, set off, carry forward of losses, depreciation, and numerous conceptual adjustments. Then comes compliance. This covers what obligations such as payment of advance tax, tax reductions or at sources, filing of returns, maintenance of the records, and repeating requirements. And fourth pillar, administration. This includes what? Assessment, reassessment, recovery, penalties, prosecution, revision, and appeals. So wherever you encounter a new provision, ask yourself that to which pillar does the provision belongs. So that simple question helps you to closely classify, helps in a classification and understand the provisions immediately. Let's now see, moving to the rules, role of the income tax rules. So Act provides the legal principles, where the income tax rules provides what? Operational details. So consider the Act as the what and the rules as the how. So for example, the Act may require maintenance of certain what? Records. So the rules prescribe that format. Act may authorize valuation. So rules prescribe the method. The Act may require what filing of a statement, and the rules specify the form, due date, and procedures. So this is why professional tax practice always involves reading the act together with the rules. Also very important to understand. So reading only the act provides an incomplete picture. Moving further, importance of forms, notification, and circulars. So tax administration extends beyond the act and rules. So various statutory forms facilitate what? Compliance, and income tax returns, audit reports, certificates, and declarations are the prescribed through statutory mechanism. So notification issued under the delegated persons bring the certain provisions into what effect, prescribe procedures, or provide exemptions wherever authorized by law. So CBDT circulars play vital role in tax administration. So they provide what? Interpretational guidance to the tax authorities and help achieve the uniform implementation across the country. So professionals therefore regularly mentor amendments, notifications, circulars, judicial pronouncements. Very important. So the tax practice is dynamic and staying updated as a professional necessity. Then let's understand living dimension of the tax law. So no legislations can anticipate every possible business transactions, not at all. So as new issues arise, what courts interrupt the law and said judicial decisions explain the legislative intent, scope of provisions, communicated value, constitutional validity, interpretation of undefined expressions, and resolution of conflicting views. So over the time, these decisions becomes an essential part of your tax jurisprudence. So this is why means accountant or experienced professionals never rely solely upon the statutory language. They also study the important judicial precedents wherever available, and judicial interpretations transforms the statutory provisions into the practical law. Let's see how professionals navigate the income tax side. Suppose a client asks, is this receipt taxable? So professional does not begin with a Google, right? So instead the approach is systematic. Identify the nature of the transaction, locate the relevant chapter, read what all connected provisions, then study applicable rules, check relevant notifications, circulars, or judicial precedents issued at that time, and then apply the law to the client's facts. So this discipline approach what minimize the errors and also ensures what legally sustainable advice. Now let's understand common mistakes while reading the tax law. So every beginner makes what certain common mistakes. Let us learn to avoid them. So the first mistake is reading only one section. That is, law is interconnected. So tax law is interconnected, right? So the second mistake is ignoring the statutory definitions. Legal definitions often differ from other language. So the third mistake can we say is keeping the provisos and explanations. So many important exceptions are hidden there. But the fourth mistake is what reading the outdated provisions and without checking the amendments. Very important. Many times it happens. So the tax law changes frequently. Fifth mistake, relying on summaries instead of reading the bare act. Read the bare act and doesn't depend on the uh, in summary of generated from AI or that. Read you bare act on your own. So professional competency is built through the direct engagement with the legislation itself. Building your income tax study strategy, how one can develop it or improve it. So if your objective is to become an expert in income tax law, develop the discipline study habits. Unless you study, you cannot be expert. So read the Bare Act every day, even if only for a what 10 to 15 minutes. Maintain a notebook containing what conceptual flowcharts rather than lengthy notes. So whenever you study a provision, ask yourself why was this enacted? Where does it fit and which permission connects with add. So solve practical examples after the understanding the concept. Most importantly, what relevant, revisit the earlier chapter regularly. So tax law is a cumulative approach. Every new topic builds upon earlier concepts. We remember that. So key takeaways from today's session, when can say, let us quickly recap the today's learning. We understand the Income Tax Act is not merely a collection of what sections. It is a carefully designed legislative framework. So we studied the hierarchy of the tax law, then the relationship between the act rules and the forms, charging provisions, machinery provisions, functional architecture, legislative drafting also we have seen, cross references, professional reading techniques. So, most importantly, we learn the conceptual understanding must always what come before the memorization. Very please note this. We learn that conceptual understanding must always come before what memorization. Memorization has no part in this. So if you master the architecture today, every subsequent episode in this series will become what much easier. So thank you so much for patient hearing. In our next episode, we move from the architecture of the act to one of its important foundations, the statutory definitions. That will also divide it into part one and part two. So stay tuned to the TaxGuru YouTube channel. If you have any questions, observations, suggestions, then do let me know via WhatsApp, email, or you can also comment below the video. So if you are not yet subscribed, then do subscribe TaxGuru YouTube channel for latest updates and video series like this, which we are conducting on a TaxGuru YouTube channel. Stay updated, stay tuned to the TaxGuru YouTube channel. Thank you so much once again. Bye bye. Take care. See you soon. Hare Krishna.